Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tan Kee Wee, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about globalization after COVID-19. Well, globalization is not new. It's been around for as long as maybe mankind has been around. In recent memory, 2,000 years ago to be exact, we had the Silk Road. And then 700 years ago, the Portuguese set out to the east and the west to colonize the known world. After the Second World War, we had the Americans who basically took over the world. The themes of globalization are common actually throughout the periods. There was exchange of technology, capital, labor, and of course people fell in love with globalization because the goods were cheaper and the variety was more varied. Globalization benefited many, many people. And of course, for the Silk Road period, one of the cities that benefited the most was Venice. In the 12th century, Venice was at its height of its power and prosperity. Globalization not only brought riches, but it also brought in disasters. In the early part of the 14th century, globalization brought in Black Death. What is this? This is actually a bacteria which devastated the known world. It was a disease carried by rats and fleas. And those who got infected would die within 2 weeks, and they were apparently horrible deaths. Well, what happened was that almost half of the total population died in those days. And the most importantly, it upset the economic structure as we knew it then. What was that? That was feudalism, the European form, whereby the king had control over the land and the peasants. Let me show you. The king is on top. He'll pass some land to his nobles, who pass it on to another layer of noblemen, who would subdivide the land and give it to the peasants to farm. In return, the peasants would either offer their men to be soldiers in the king's wars, and of course, all the harvest, part of the harvest would have to be returned to the nobleman and then up to the king. When Black Death struck Europe in those days, there was chaos, because no one knew the cause of the diseases. They normally target out the minorities like the Jews, foreigners, lepers. They were all blamed, and apparently a lot of them were killed. And because a lot of people died, there wasn't enough labor to harvest the crops. And of course, in those world when they didn't really know what caused the Black Death, many people turned to religion. When people died, when farmers died, land prices fell. And of course, with shortage of manpower, wages rose. And those surviving, those who lived through, had to pick up the jobs. So a lot of migration happened in those days because the remaining workers could decide to go to another part of the Europe to live and start a new life. Well, at the end of Black Death, there was a period of prosperity, and today we call it the European Renaissance. This was between the 15th to the 17th centuries. At that time, people began to appreciate life more, and a lot of people were freed from slave labor, so they were able to turn their talent elsewhere into studying the Greek philosophy, and then practicing new forms of art, architecture, science, literature, and politics. These two paintings show you actually what happened. On your left is an art during the medieval period, and on the right is an art from the Renaissance period. You notice that the art from the Renaissance period were more lifelike. Okay, so it was this period where people began to be aware of that, maybe religion, science, philosophy, and it was, quite evident in the different forms of art that surface. This current pandemic is actually no different. It has struck us suddenly, and we all have to adapt. One of the things that we have to do now is practice social distancing. And of course, with this form of practice, it affects a lot of business. Starbucks, for instance, has announced that it's going to close many of its branches because it's not viable anymore. In the office, we now cannot cram a lot of people in one small office space. We have to space them out. In fact, a lot of employers are telling their staff not to come back to work, and if possible, work from home. What are the consequences? Well, for one, there'll be less need for office space, and so rents and prices will fall. Learning for us and for students in general will be different too. We all have to go on to online classes. But hopefully it's only temporary. I say that because we are all human beings, and there's still the need to be close to another human being. That's why I think it's only temporary. In time to come, students will want to come back together and study together and talk to their lecturers and professors. But not all things will return. Some things will change for good. For instance, our shopping. A lot of us who were not used to shopping online have in the past few months been forced into it. And we also been forced to use e-payments. And once you start using it, it can be very addictive. And not many people would want to go back to the old ways. Last month, there was a new development, and this will transform the way we shop, the way we buy things, and the way we transfer our money. I'm talking about the introduction of the digital yuan by China last month. This digital yuan is very different from what they have now, which is the WeChat Pay and Alipay. WeChat Pay and Alipay is an existing platform, and it's very popular in China. More than 70% of people use it. Every day, the transaction is in the millions. In fact, for last year, $49 trillion worth of goods were transacted in China using WeChat Pay and Alipay. This volume of transaction is 3 times the GDP of China. And Alipay is now in more than 50 other countries all over the world. What's the advantages of using digital yuan? Well, for the users, you don't need a bank account. All you need is a smartphone. Let me explain further. This is the current system which we have in China, where people use WeChat Pay and Alipay. Every month, your salary is credited into your bank account, so you must open the bank account first. Okay? Then you get your phone, your smartphone, and your app, and then you transfer your money from your bank into your smartphone. And then when you buy something, your money will be transferred to the seller through your handphone. With digital yuan, it's totally different. Your salary does not go into your bank account. Your salary goes straight into your phone. And then when you buy things, the money will move from you, the customer, to the seller or whatever, parking fines, whatever you have. That is the big difference between existing WeChat and Pay and the forthcoming digital yuan. What's the advantage of digital yuan to the Central Bank of China? Well, they still have control of the money supply. And of course, every yuan is can be tracked. And so all the crooks and money launderers won't like this new form of payment or form of money. But how much will it transform the world of e-payments? Well, I'm sure the people who do not want to be detected, the money launderers and the underworld operators, they are probably few and far between. For most of us, I think we will embrace the e-payment, and this one could transform the world in a big way. In 1994, Jeff Bezos has this idea of starting online shopping for books. At that time, a lot of people dismissed the idea. No, we only want to buy a book after we have flipped through the first few pages. Well, as you know, his idea gained currency, and about 9 years ago, the typical bookstores had to close. And not only that, this online purchases have gone into other areas. Just last month, retail stores were also made bankrupt by online trading. Let's look back at money again. How do we pass money to the next person? Well, just pass the cash. That's one way. But if you got to hand money over to someone far, far away, what do? Well, in the past, we used an intermediary, like Western Union, okay? And Western Union would use machines like telex machines. They have codes, and they'll send it to the other bank in the other country. Telex machine was sort of used until the 1970s. In 1973, there was a new invention called SWIFT. This is actually a Belgium-based cooperative. But what it's doing is still in existence. Is that let's say you want to send money to another friend in another country, you go through your first bank. Your first bank will go through SWIFT. SWIFT will send the money to maybe another bank in the other country. And then from there, that bank in the other country will pass it to your friend. That's how it works. It is more efficient than telex machines because it is more precise. It's got codes and all that. And that's why SWIFT became very popular since it was established in 1973. Today it has more than 11,000 members. And it's actually an SMS system. No money is transferred. It's just instructions between banks through SWIFT about how much to pay to who on the other side of the world. Today, most of the messages are actually for payments, but about less than half of it are actually to confirm security and treasury transactions. So it has many users. Who dominates SWIFT? Well, although it started off as a cooperative, actually the US banks and the US dollar today dominate SWIFT. How is that possible? Very simple. Since the world globalized after the Second World War, and the main currency we use is actually US dollar. So the US dollar transactions became dominant. And the laws are such that every time you send a US dollar from one European country to another European country, it has to go through a US bank. And once you go through a US bank, you fall under US laws. So, and because the US banks and US dollars dominate the world, now the Americans dominate the SWIFT system. Well, SWIFT is very convenient, except that its convenience can be turned against those whom the US government do not like. And over the years, we have witnessed that certain countries have been inconvenienced by the US government through sanctions. So if Iran wants to sell oil to another country, then the US applies sanctions on Iran. Iran cannot process the oil payments in US dollar, so Iran is stuck. So these sanctions are very powerful as far as the US government is concerned. When sanctions are imposed on Iran, well, not only Iran suffers, Iran's trading partners also suffer. And Iran's biggest trading partners are actually the EU and China. And so they are heavily penalized for trading with Iran. In response, the EU is trying to do something about it. Okay, and a few years ago, well, before I say that, Iran is, this chart shows how important Iran is to the EU and China. They're actually the top two trading partners for Iran. Iran, of course, sells mainly oil. Now, like I mentioned before, the Europeans are frustrated that the US imposed sanctions on Iran through SWIFT. So in the past few years, they've been trying to come up with their own system, Target 2. The Russians sorry for the error. The Russians and Chinese are also trying to come out with their own system. The Russians call it SPFS, and the Chinese call the system the CIPS. Both are still in this development stage. It's not ready yet. Okay. Now, back to the sanctions imposed by the US. The US is able to impose such sanctions for one good reason. It's because since 1945, the US has been the superpower. And it is a superpower. Why? One of the reasons it has remained a superpower is because it has a US dollar to support it. The US dollar is not just another country's money. It is a reserve currency. A reserve currency is basically a currency that the whole known world uses it. Over history, Western history anyway, we had the Romans, the Eastern Romans, and the Florin, and then the Dutch, the Spanish, the British sterling, and then of course, after the Second World War, the US dollar has been the reserve currencies. All these currencies in the past, gold has been used to back paper money, which means that we are talking about gold standard. That means a currency whereby it is backed by gold, mainly gold, sometimes silver and other things. But the gold standard has come and gone many times throughout history. As far as the Western Europe is concerned, since the 18th century, there have been many, many gold standards. They come and go. The first one was by Britain, and at that time, 1 ounce of gold is equivalent to 3.87 sterling pounds. The thing with this gold standard is that it goes in a cycle. At first, we use maybe gold to exchange for businesses. And then we invented paper money, but it's always linked with some asset. So gold, it backs paper money. And then after a while, people realize that it's not necessary, or it's more convenient to have paper money without any backing. And then we move on to a fiat currency, which we are today since 1971. And of course, fiat currencies history tells us, don't survive forever. And sooner or later, they'll fail. And when after they fail, history will tell us that we all go back to a hard money system. So where are we today in this world? I think we are towards the end of the fiat money life cycle. Our last gold standard is the Bretton Woods. This was conceived just before the end of the war. And the agreement was this, that after the war, the US dollar was the strongest and still is the strongest. 35 US dollars will be pegged to 1 gold ounce. All other currencies of the world, whether it's British pound, German mark, or French franc, they could be exchanged for US dollar. There'll be a fair exchange rate. So if you have British sterling pound, you are not able to change it into gold. You must first change your sterling pound into US dollar. And then with your 35 US dollars, you go to the bank in America and exchange it for your ounce of gold. That was the Bretton Woods system. So everybody ought to behave, okay? You are not allowed to print more paper money unless you find the gold, okay? So in the case of the US government is not allowed to print 35 US dollars if they cannot find 1 ounce of gold. That was the system, and all was supposed to obey it. Okay, but of course the US didn't. During the 50s and 60s, it was involved in 2 very expensive wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And that cost a lot of money. On top of that, President Johnson, at that time in the 60s, wanted to help the poor and the disadvantaged in America. He had this welfare program called the 𝗏𝐿 Society. And all these things cost money as well, building of hospitals, building of roads. And so what did America do? They just printed more US dollars without looking for gold. All this cost money. So they just printed money. Initially, the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Germans, they realized that, hey, these Americans, they are printing a lot of US dollars, but they suspect that they didn't find the equivalent gold before they printed more US dollars. So what did they do? They took whatever US dollars they had and then brought them to the US and exchanged it for gold. See, they brought their dollars to the US and in return took out their gold from the US and brought it back. Towards the late 60s, there was a great outflow of gold from the US, to the point whereby the Americans felt that they'll be losing too much gold. Well, in 1971, President Nixon came out and said that, sorry, no one will be allowed to exchange their US dollars for gold anymore. So in a sense, the US government cheated the rest of the world. Since August 1971, the system was what we call fiat currency. Fiat currency, what backs the paper money that we have? Nothing. All central banks can print as much money as they like. And what determines the exchange rate? Well, the demand and supply for that currency. What's the advantage of paper money? Well, because basically the supply of gold is limited. So all central banks would have encountered great difficulties when they come across a recession or crisis because they need to get things moving and pay for public works and all that. So that is one big advantage of fiat or paper money. You don't need to find the gold for it. But of course, the main disadvantage of paper money is that central banks will be tempted and they'll print more money, in fact, a lot more money. And in the end, what happens, history tells us, is that all the fiat money system will eventually collapse. Well, the US has been printing lots of money. And if we were to take $1 in 1913, today the same dollar is only worth 3 cents in terms of purchasing power of what it was worth in 1913. So over a span of 100 over years, the US dollar has lost about 97% of its purchasing power. Okay, what happened after Nixon took the world off the Bretton Woods standard? Well, nobody wanted the whole US dollar anymore. So they all dumped the US dollar. So this is the US dollar against the yen in early part of 1970s. Nobody wanted the dollars. And so at that time, the $1 was 350 yen. So everybody started selling the dollar because there's no demand. So the Americans were very worried that nobody wanted the whole US dollars anymore. You know, because basically they'll be a naughty boy and they'll be printing more US dollars than anybody else. What did they do? They had a smart solution. They plan to link US dollar to oil. How does this work? Well, around 1974, Kissinger led a team to Saudi Arabia and made a deal with the Saudis. At that time, the Saudi Arabian royal family was maybe in a shaky position. You know? There were other royal families trying to vie for power. So the Americans went there to say, look, House of Saud, please price all your oil sales in US dollar. And since you're Saudi Arabia, you have the biggest reserves of oil, you can influence all the other OPEC members to sell oil in US dollars as well. So, of course, the Saudi Arabians will say, what do I get in return? Well, in return, the US will protect the royal family of Saud. Okay? So to them, why not? I get to keep my monarchy. Okay? And in return, I sell oil and convince everyone in OPEC to sell oil in US dollars. What do I do with the US dollars? I use the US dollars and I buy treasuries, which is basically bonds, IOUs. And so the US dollars that they collect is sort of recycled back into the US treasuries. At that time, the Saudi Arabians were quite happy with it. And in fact, they're still happy with the arrangement today. This arrangement is called the petrodollar. And this is how the petrodollar system started way back in the early 70s. See, the beauty of this petrodollar system is that suddenly there is a demand for US dollars. You know, let's say you're Singaporean. You want to buy oil, which the whole world needs oil, right? You have to change your Singapore dollar into US dollar before you buy oil and ship it back to Singapore. So because of the petrodollar system, you have to buy US dollar. So there is a demand for US dollar. And to make it better, they price all, not only oil, but other raw materials in US dollar. Tin, rubber, gold, everything is in US dollars. So the whole world has to buy US dollars before they buy those things. Secondly, international trade is conducted in US dollars. And thirdly, encourage all countries of the world to keep foreign reserves and keep them in US dollar. All the two major exchanges of the world in New York, in Chicago and London, all of them stick to this rule. So a lot of commodities are sold in US dollars only. So that's the big advantage of being the reserve currency, the US dollar. No currency conversion costs, and the US government can sell bonds in using US dollar. No currency conversion at all. So simple. And the US government can run huge trade deficits, okay? And of course, they can print money anytime they wish, because the whole world, there's a demand for US dollar. In the past many years, the US has waged war against Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars cost over $3 trillion. And the US has more than 800 military bases all over the world. All these things cost money. And how did they do it? Very simple. They just printed more money. So this is how the US dollar made the US empire so powerful. Give you another example. During the 1940s up to 1991, there was this Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. This war is basically to ask which is better, an economy that is run by the state or an economy that is run by the free market. So in this Cold War, there were two great races. The race to the moon to see whether the Soviets or the Americans reach the moon. And of course, the Americans reached the moon first. The second race was who could build more and better missiles. Again, the USA built better missiles, maybe not more, but better missiles than the Soviets. And how did the US win these two races? Again, simply by printing more money. When the US military wants to build rockets or planes, let's say they need to buy iron ore, they use US dollar, go to Australia or any country and say, look, I give you US dollar, you give me iron ore. And the suppliers will be happy to take US dollars. Whereas for the Soviets, when they want to buy, let's say, iron ore from Australia, if they go to Australia and give them rubles, Australia probably didn't want it. Say, I want US dollar. So the Soviets have to change their rubles into US dollars before they get their raw materials from Australia. So from the word go of these two races, the Soviets were already at a big disadvantage. The US could simply print money and win the race. So it's no surprise that in 1989, Berlin Wall fell, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union disintegrated. There were actually two other currencies in the world throughout this 70 over years that could have been reserve currencies, the Japanese yen and the German Deutsche Mark. But these two countries were defeated enemies in the Second World War. And over all these years, they were discouraged from internationalizing their currencies. So the path was left for the US dollar to remain dominant, and they did. And that's how the US empire controlled the world. The US dollar dominates the world today. When it comes to official reserves, about 60% or more of the world's official reserves are the US dollar. Euro takes up 20%, but still 3 times more is the US dollar. Daily trade in Forex, almost 80% will be in US dollar or US related trade, whether it's sterling dollar, euro dollar, Japanese yen dollar, it's all back to the dollar. Who dares to challenge the US dollar? Nobody dares. Not the Japanese, not the Germans in the past 70 over years. But 20 years ago, somebody tried. His name is Saddam Hussein. Iraq sold or still sells a lot of oil to Europe. So to Saddam Hussein, it was ridiculous that he should sell his oil to European countries using US dollar. And also at the time, maybe he didn't really like the US anymore. So he started an exchange selling oil in euros. Now, of course, if this fashion starts to grow, it will undermine the US dollar. So within 3 years, Saddam Hussein was gone. About 11 years ago, Colonel Gaddafi also wanted to do something similar. He told all the Arab nations, look, let's sell our oil and we only want gold. Well, again, this was another way of undermining the US dollar and the petrodollar system. Within 2 years, he was gone. Of course, we were told that these two tyrants must go because they did not practice democracy or human rights. But of course, now we know that's not the truth.